Ella Locke stepped off the transport shuttle onto Martian soil for the first time in 18 years, her breath catching as the familiar red dust swirled around her boots. The spaceport at Francono looked nothing like she remembered. The old colonial architecture had been replaced by angular Martian designs, all clean lines and defensive practicality. But the sky was the same pale amber she'd dreamed about for nearly 2 decades, and the gravity felt like coming home to her own body. After years of adaptation chambers and artificial environments, "Transport to Sector 7 leaves in 30 minutes, announced a voice over the spaceport's communication system. "All passengers bound for the agricultural district, please proceed to Platform C." Ella shouldered her single bag. Everything she owned fit into one worn duffel that had traveled with her from Shannon Station to the Belt, to Jupiter's moons, and finally here. She'd kept it packed for 18 years, always ready for the day she could come home. Now that day had arrived, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for what she might find. The transport was half full of other returnees, their faces showing the same mixture of anticipation and dread that Ella felt. Some clutched faded photographs or handwritten addresses. Others stared out the windows with the hollow expressions of people trying to reconcile memory with reality. "First time back?" asked the woman sitting beside her, an older Martian with the pale complexion of someone who'd spent decades in artificial environments. "Since I was 7, Ella replied. "My family had a farm in Sector 7. We grew soybeans and hydroponic vegetables for the local settlements." The woman nodded sympathetically. "I'm from Sector 12. My husband and I ran a equipment repair shop." Her voice carried the careful neutrality of someone discussing the dead. "The Earth forces used our neighborhood for urban warfare training after they cleared us out." Ella felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd heard reports about what Earth had done to evacuated areas, but she'd always hoped, that maybe the farm had been spared, that something of her childhood might have survived. The transport's route took them through what had once been the heart of Martian agriculture, endless fields of red soil that had been coaxed into productivity through generations of careful cultivation. Now the landscape was scarred with craters and scorch marks, abandoned Earth military equipment rusting in the Martian sun. Warning signs in multiple languages marked areas where unexploded ordnance made the ground too dangerous to traverse. "Shannon Station," Ella murmured, remembering the massive refueling depot where she'd spent most of her exile. The station's constant motion between the outer planets had meant the artificial gravity was always shifting, the stars outside the viewports changing every few months as the station's massive thrusters adjusted its position in the complex gravitational dance between Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, and Uranus. She had been one of maybe 200 Martian refugees aboard Shannon Station, scattered among the depot's 15,000 residents. Most of the station's population were traders, freight handlers, and maintenance crews who worked the shipping routes between the outer colonies. They'd been kind enough to the Martian refugees, but kindness wasn't the same as belonging. Ella had grown up in the station's agricultural bays, learning to tend hydroponic gardens that fed the transient population. The work had been familiar enough. Plants were plants, whether they grew in Martian soil or nutrient solution. But it had never felt like home. Home was red soil and open sky, and the smell of rain on the horizon during dust storm season. "Sector 7 Agricultural District," the transport driver announced. "End of the line." Ella gathered her bag and stepped off the transport into a landscape that was both familiar and utterly changed. The old access road was still there, though pitted with blast craters and partially overgrown with hardy native plants. In the distance, she could see the skeletal remains of what had once been the sector's processing facility. Its storage silos collapsed and twisted. She began walking toward where the Locke family farm should be, following a path she'd memorized in childhood, but hadn't traveled in 18 years. Every step brought new evidence of what Earth had done to her world. Artillery shell casings scattered in the dust, the twisted wreckage of vehicles that might have been Earth military or captured Martian civilian transports, warning signs in Earth standard marking areas where ordnance disposal teams hadn't yet finished their work. The farmhouse appeared around a bend in the access road, and Ella stopped dead in her tracks. It was gone. Where the two-story adobe structure had stood, where she'd learned to read at the kitchen table, where her mother had taught her to identify edible native plants, where 3 generations of Locke family had built their lives from red dust and stubborn hope, there was nothing but a crater filled with stagnant water and debris. Ella approached slowly, her boots crunching on scattered concrete and twisted metal. The blast had been massive, thorough, designed not just to destroy but to erase. Even the foundation was gone, reduced to scattered chunks of masonry that barely hinted at the structure that had once stood here. "Direct hit," she whispered, kneeling beside what might have been a piece of her mother's ceramic cooking pots. They didn't just bomb it. They targeted it specifically. Around the crater, the farmland stretched away in all directions. But it wasn't farmland anymore. The carefully maintained irrigation channels had been filled with debris. The soil was pocked with explosion craters of varying sizes, some filled with standing water that reflected the pale Martian sky like scattered mirrors. Red warning flags on metal stakes marked areas where ordnance disposal teams had identified unexploded shells and bombs. Ella counted at least 40 warning flags across what had once been her family's soybean fields. She pulled out her datapad and accessed the refugee records, searching for any information about what had happened to the farm. The files were fragmentary. Earth had been systematic about destroying Martian records, but she found references to live fire training exercises and ordnance disposal practice. They'd used her family's farm as a firing range. For 12 years, Earth soldiers had practiced their killing skills on the land where Ella had learned to walk, where her grandparents were buried beneath a small grove of Earth-imported oak trees. Every building, every field, every carefully tended acre had been treated as a target for artillery practice and bomb disposal training. Ella sat down heavily on a chunk of concrete that might have once been part of the farmhouse's front steps. She tried to picture the place as it had been, the vegetable gardens behind the house, the workshop where her father had maintained the irrigation equipment, the small cemetery where 4 generations of Locke family rested beneath simple stone markers. All of it was gone, not just destroyed but systematically obliterated over more than a decade of military exercises. Earth hadn't just conquered Mars, they'd tried to erase every trace that Martians had ever existed. "Miss?" a voice called from behind her. "Miss, you shouldn't be here alone. This area hasn't been fully cleared yet." Ella turned to see a Martian ordnance disposal technician approaching, his protective gear marked with the symbols of the new Martian Defense Force. He moved carefully, his steps following a precise path marked by temporary barriers. "This was my family's farm," Ella said simply. The technician's expression softened with understanding. "Locke Farm. I've been working this sector for 3 weeks. The whole area is contaminated with unexploded ordnance, artillery shells, mortar rounds, training explosives. Earth forces used it as a live fire range for over a decade." "Is there anything left?" Ella asked. "Anything at all?" The technician consulted his datapad. "We found some artifacts during the clearance work, personal effects that survived in the debris field. They're being cataloged at the Franco Knoll Historical Preservation Center." He paused, studying her face. Did you know the family that lived here?" "I am the family that lived here," Ella replied. "I was 7 when we evacuated. My parents, my grandparents, my little brother." She gestured toward the crater where the house had stood. "They didn't make it off-world." The technician's face went carefully neutral, the expression of someone who'd heard this story too many times already. "I'm sorry for your loss. The Preservation Center might have more information about what happened to them." Ella nodded, though she already knew what had happened. The Locke family had been on the evacuation lists, scheduled for transport off Mars during the final weeks before the orbital bombardment. But the ships had been overloaded, the schedules chaotic, and someone had made the decision that farmers were lower priority than technicians and administrators. Her parents had put 7-year-old Ella on a transport with her aunt, promising they'd follow on the next ship. That next ship had never come. "The clearance work will take another 6 months," the technician continued. "After that, the soil will need to be remediated, tested for chemical contamination, cleared of metal fragments. But eventually, this could be farmland again." Ella looked out across the cratered landscape, trying to imagine it restored to productivity. New irrigation channels could be dug, the soil could be cleaned and replanted. But it would never be the Locke farm. It would never be the place where her father had taught her to read weather patterns in the cloud formations over Olympus Mons, or where her mother had sung old earth ballads while tending the vegetable gardens. "Shannon Station," she murmured, remembering the massive depot's agricultural bays where she'd spent her teenage years. The station had been in constant motion, its massive thrusters firing regularly to maintain position in the shifting gravitational fields between the outer planets. She'd learned to sleep through the vibration of course corrections, to work in artificial gravity that changed subtly as the station's orientation shifted. The other refugees aboard Shannon had talked constantly about going home, about the Mars they remembered and the Mars they hoped to find when the war ended. Ella had participated in those conversations, but privately she'd wondered if home could ever really be the same place you'd left behind. Now she knew. "There's a memorial being built at Franco Knoll," the technician said gently, "for families like yours, civilians who died during the evacuation." Ella shook her head. "They didn't die during the evacuation. They died because the evacuation failed them." She stood up, brushing red dust from her clothes. "But thank you for the information and for the work you're doing here." She began walking back toward the transport stop, leaving the crater that had once been home behind her. As she walked, she pulled out her datapad and began composing a message to her cousin Dave, who was coordinating refugee resettlement on Ceres. "The farm is gone," she typed. "House, fields, everything, used as a firing range for 12 years. Coming back to Ceres on the next transport. Maybe home isn't a place you can go back to. Maybe it's something you have to build new." She paused at the crest of a small hill, looking back one last time at the landscape of her childhood. In the distance, construction crews were working on something. New buildings, new infrastructure, the beginning of whatever Mars would become now that it was free. Ella had spent 18 years learning to be Martian in exile, preserving the memory of a world that no longer existed. Now she had a choice. She could mourn what was lost, or she could help build what came next. She sealed the message to Dave and added a postscript. "Actually, scratch that. I'm staying. Mars needs farmers, and the Locke family has been working this soil for 4 generations. Earth destroyed our farm, but they didn't destroy our knowledge. Time to plant something new." As the transport arrived to take her back to Franco Knoll, Ella looked out across the scarred landscape and began planning. The soil could be cleaned, new irrigation systems could be built, and somewhere in the preserved artifacts at the historical center, there might be seeds, genetic samples from the plants her family had spent decades adapting to Martian conditions. Home wasn't a place you could go back to, but it was something you could choose to rebuild, even from ashes and unexploded ordnance and the stubborn red soil that had always been the real heart of Mars. The secret to surviving the loss of everything, Ella realized, was understanding that everything could be built again. Just not in the same way. Many thanks to my channel members and Pathfinder Tommy Boston for making this video possible. Thank you for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to leave this video a like and subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this. Video shares, memberships, and super thanks help the channel grow as well, so feel free to partner with this channel in that way as we grow. With that all said, thank you again for listening to the story, and thank you for your time. On the left side of your screen are some videos I think you might be interested in. I hope to see you in the next one.